Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're focusing on the recent NATO summit in The Hague.
You're right.
We've looked into it to sort of understand the key decisions, but also the dynamics behind the scenes.
Yeah, and this deep dive, it really aims to shed light on how these major global players are, well, navigating things. Shifting alliances, security landscapes.
Especially with defense spending, diplomacy.
Exactly. And of course, the whole situation with Russia and Ukraine. We'll try to uncover the main agreements, but also maybe some of the tensions under the surface.
Okay, let's start with the money then. A big outcome, maybe the big outcome, was this historic agreement on defense spending.
It really was. A plan got approved for NATO members to significantly boost their defense spending.
Significantly how?
Well, the target is 5% of their GDP, their gross domestic product, by 2035.
5%. Wow. That's way up from the previous goal, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. More than double the old 2% target, which, was only set back in 2014. So this marks a really profound shift.
Okay, 5%. So how's that money meant to be used? What's the breakdown there?
Right. So it splits into two parts, basically. 3.5% is allocated directly for defense needs. So that's your equipment, personnel, operations, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And then the other 1.5% is specifically for defense-related infrastructure. Think bases, logistics, cybersecurity capabilities.
Got it.
And context here is key. This is actually the highest overall spending target NATO set since, well, the Cold War era.
Really says something.
Yeah.
And the driver was, obviously the Russia-Ukraine situation played a role.
Definitely. That was a major influence, a clear sort of push for increased readiness. But it was also something U.S. President Trump strongly advocated for.
Right. And was this just about military muscle, or was there a unity aspect too, trying to keep the alliance together?
Precisely. That's a huge part of it. The goal wasn't just showing military strength, but also reassuring everyone about cohesion.
Cohesion, especially given maybe some worries about U.S. President Trump's stance on NATO?
Exactly. There were these background concerns that he might challenge the alliance's unity or commitment. So in return for promising these, pretty substantial investments, the other allies really expected U.S. President Trump to clearly reaffirm the Article 5 commitment.
The Mutual Defense Clause.
Mutual Defense Clause, yes. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's the absolute cornerstone.
And any doubt about that from the U.S. would be tricky.
Hugely destabilizing. So getting that reaffirmation was seen as vital for trust, for stability within the alliance.
Okay, so let's talk about the atmosphere there. It sounds like U.S. President Trump's presence really shaped things.
Yeah, that seemed to be the case. Observations from the summit suggested that the other alliance countries maybe softened their language on Russia in the final statement.
Softened how?
Well, the communique, the final document, it was noticeably shorter, and the language seemed perhaps weaker compared to previous years.
And you think that was linked to getting the Article 5 confirmation?
It appeared to be a key part of the equation, yes. Maybe a strategic concession, you could say, to ensure his buy-in on that core commitment.
Interesting. And it also felt like European leaders were maybe going the extra mile to keep U.S. President Trump engaged, trying to avoid any surprises.
There were reports of that, yeah. Concerns that he might, leave abruptly, like what happened at a G7 meeting previously.
Right.
So this apparently led to efforts that some described as trying to, appease him.
Such as?
Things like cutting down the discussion times, keeping things brief, and apparently arranging the big group photo before the main working session even started.
Oh, interesting. Why before?
The thinking, reportedly, was to guarantee a positive image, a photo op, for U.S. President Trump to show back home, no matter how the actual talks went later.
Wow. A lot of diplomatic maneuvering.
Intense, yes. It really reflected the high stakes involved in keeping that U.S. commitment solid.
So amidst all this, where did that leave Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky? His country's situation is usually so central.
That was a noticeable shift. Despite the war in Ukraine being, historically central to these summits, Zelensky's role seemed somewhat diminished this time.
Diminished how? He wasn't in the main meetings?
He wasn't present in the main hall during those core sessions with the other leaders, no. He had separate personal meetings scheduled instead, including one with U.S. President Trump.
And how did that go?
Well, reports suggested U.S. President Trump appeared to pay less attention to him during their interaction. It was quite a contrast to past summits where Ukraine's concerns were really front and center.
That shift really underlines those internal pressures you mentioned.
It does.
Okay, so beyond those main dynamics, we also saw individual leaders staking out their positions. French President Emmanuel Macron, for instance, he was talking about future dialogue with Russia.
Yes. Macron voiced this idea that Europe can't just stay in a state of constant escalation, endlessly arming itself.
Right.
He argued that any future security setup for Europe has to include talks about security guarantees, conditions for dialogue with Russia.
Potentially arms limits like in the Cold War.
Potentially, yes. He suggested something along those lines, aiming to sort of mitigate damage, rebuild some trust eventually. He also made a point about trade.
Yes, the trade war comment.
Right. Calling for an end to that between NATO members, pushing for a quick resolution to those ongoing EU-US trade disputes, things like steel tariffs, digital taxes. He argued they just create needless friction.
Okay, and flipping to the Russian perspective, how did Russian President Putin see all this NATO activity?
Well, Russian President Putin flatly dismissed claims that Russia plans to attack NATO, called them incredible lies.
So, from his viewpoint.
From the Kremlin's viewpoint, this portrayal of Russia as, quote, a monster, is basically a tactic. It's designed to scare alliance members into agreeing to higher defense spending, like that 5% target.
A justification narrative in their eyes.
Essentially, yes.
Right.
Justifying NATO's own military buildup rather than reflecting a genuine threat from Moscow.
And his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, also commented on global security.
He did. Lavrov stated pretty bluntly that the global security architecture is being dismantled by NATO policies, and specifically by U.S. actions.
Which actions did he point to?
He mentioned the U.S. withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the destruction of the INF treaty, the one banning intermediate-range nuclear missiles.
Right, key treaties.
Exactly. And he raised concerns about the future of the New START treaty, which is the last big arms control deal left between the U.S. and Russia. He sees all this as really damaging strategic stability.
And Russia updated its own nuclear doctrine recently, too.
They did, in 2024, which Lavrov sort of framed as a warning to the West about the potential consequences of getting involved in any attack on Russia, possibly through various means, not just nuclear ones. He also added that Russia would seriously think before rebuilding ties with the West, even if the West proposed it. Shows deep distrust.
Okay, so back within NATO. Despite that headline agreement on spending, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were nuances, maybe disagreements.
That's right. While the 5% target by 2035 was agreed upon on paper, some countries expressed, let's say, reservations or interpretations that hinted at flexibility.
Like who?
Well, Spain, for example, indicated they intended to commit only about 2.1% of GDP to military needs. That's quite far off the 5% target.
Yeah.
And the Belgian prime minister suggested the wording of the agreement might allow for flexible interpretation, implying maybe different ways to reach it or perhaps a longer time frame.
So economic realities, domestic politics, still playing a big role.
Absolutely. It suggests that getting all members to that 5% won't be a straight path.
And it wasn't just money. Views on the actual threat from Russia also seemed to differ quite a bit.
Yes, quite sharply in some cases. You had Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, stating that Russia is, in his view, not strong enough to pose a real threat to NATO.
Which aligns with Hungary's generally different stance towards Moscow.
It often does, yes, driven by things like energy ties. But then, in complete contrast, you had German Chancellor Friedrich Merz declaring that Russia threatens the whole world, the entire political structure of our continent.
Wow, stark difference.
Very stark. It really highlights those varied perceptions within the alliance, influenced by geography, history, economics. And these fundamental disagreements on the threat itself can complicate finding a truly unified strategy sometimes.
You mentioned German Chancellor Merz. He seemed to have a bit of a unique relationship or dynamic with U.S. President Trump there.
That was an observation, yes. Merz seemed to be quite central in talks with U.S. President Trump, maybe showing a confidence others didn't.
Any idea why?
Well, speculation is it might stem from a strong relationship he apparently built with U.S. President Trump early on in his chancellorship.
Right, there was that White House visit.
Exactly, where Merz famously gave U.S. President Trump a personalized golf club, a gesture that seemed to land well.
And the thinking is this rapport might give Merz some influence.
There's a view, yeah, that because of this relationship, Merz might be positioned to potentially influence U.S. President Trump, maybe push him towards supporting tougher sanctions on Russia, for instance. Apparently, President Zelensky also saw this as a possible avenue.
Interesting dynamic there.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive shows, I think, that while NATO put forward this united front on boosting defense spending, which is significant,
Yeah, a major step.
underneath that you have these complex currents, diplomatic strategies, national interests clashing or aligning, these shifting global dynamics. It's all very multifaceted.
So the future of that transatlantic relationship, the security architecture,
Huh.
it's still very much a work in progress.
Absolutely. It's subject to ongoing negotiation, ongoing evolution, shaped by both those collective goals and, the personalities and approaches of individual leaders.
And these big questions remain, don't they? About potential future dialogue with Russia, how these defense commitments will actually play out in practice, the roles of key leaders. It's all going to keep shaping international relations going forward. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.